groups of people do things together in order to be able to maintain these common pool resources, and that's a really crucial insight into all of that stuff. Right? One of the other ways, of course, that collective action breaks down, and other guys that won Nobel Prizes a couple of years ago, was talking about information asymmetries. The fact that you know something that I don't, or that we're just operating in a very incomplete world of information. And that leads to market failures, prisoner's dilemmas, and various different other things that game theorists kind of talk about. Right? But I think there's another sort of way in which we can get at these coordination problems that comes out of legal anthropology. It comes out of not just the kinds of things that Lynn Ostrom is studying in her social solutions to coordination problems. It's a very fancy term called herding cats. Right? The herding cats problem, which you're all familiar with, is when you try and get your buddies together to try and do something. Right? And it's not just the fact that you don't understand each other or that you don't have the adequate information. It's just that you're sometimes operating across very different ways of thinking about how to spend your time. Right? That's a facile sort of example, perhaps, but it's a really, really serious issue in these environments that I was talking about before regarding legal pluralism, where you have very different normative orders that run the world. Right? Land is the quintessential realm in which that happens. Right? If I'm an Australian Aborigine and I'm talking to an Australian government official, right, our ontological understandings of what land is are so wildly different, right, that it's just crazy to think of this simply as an information asymmetries kind of problem. Right? Where the software in our brains that is making sense of this thing called land is so different that it simply makes the coordination across that really, really difficult. Right? If you go to Vanuatu, where they're trying to do, where there's a huge amount of pressures to raise capital through selling off land to investors who want their little piece of paradise in the Pacific Islands, right? There isn't something to be sold, right? Investors want their little certificate with their little GPS coordinates that say, yes, this little piece of land here is mine and you can't come on it, right? Villagers know full well what's at stake here, but they don't have the conception that you can sell land, that you can put a little deed on it, that you can put GPS coordinates on it, is so different, right? That you just can't have, at face value, a coherent conversation around what this thing is, right? And the development problem around these modernization of rule systems is the ways in which these very ontologically different ways of understanding what a resource is starts to cohere, right? Starts to emerge into something that both sides can own and understand. Right? How does that happen? Does it happen because some genius in the National Law School figures out the right way to do that? No. It happens case by case because each of these different systems is incredibly different. Right? In a country like Vanuatu with 200,000 people, they speak 56 different languages. Right? In a country of 200,000 people. Right? There is no way that there is a solution to how you figure out how to manage land in that particular context. What type of solution is there? A negotiated solution. A solution painstakingly put together by someone who figures out how to be a bridge, a discursive bridge between this world of foreign investors and this world of local customary understandings of land. Right? And patiently, through a long process of deliberation and back and forth, if that's done equitably and fairly, then gradually you start to get some coherence emerging. Right? So it's a bit facile to call it the herding cats problem. I haven't come up with a fancier name for it yet. But the basic problem, as I hope you can start to understand here, is when you have these very different, and I use I think it is the right philosophical term, but apologies if it sounds a little esoteric, but the ontological, which means what is the actual status of this thing we are talking about, right? And if you're paying rent on an apartment here, right, you have a very particular ontological understanding of the contract that you've signed, the bedroom that you sleep in, right? That is all enshrined in a very particular understanding of what property is and what land is. And we all understand that, right? It's the fact that we understand that is what makes a property market possible, right? But when you have completely different understandings of what land is, right? When land cannot be bought and sold, when the fact that my ancestors lived and died on this land for the last 40,000 years is the way in which I understand the land, and that I don't even put shoes on my feet because I'm not allowed to disconnect myself from the land. And I had a student at Harvard, would you believe, 8 years ago, who actually had a life like that. He grew up in a village in the Philippines, wearing bare feet, didn't even put shoes on his feet until he was 20 years old. Right? Why? Because in his way of understanding the land, you had to maintain constant contact with it. And he said he nearly had a nervous breakdown the time he just put flip-flops on his feet. Right? The first time he was disconnected from the land. Right? That's what we're talking about here. These are not just classic information asymmetries or markets for lemons and buying and selling used cars, as pervasive as they are within a given space for understanding what buying and selling a car is, right? For these kinds of negotiations, where people have such unbelievably, qualitatively different ways of understanding what it is we're trying to exchange, you need a very different kind of theoretical apparatus, I would suggest, for trying to make sense of that. Okay, we have a third class of problems, which we are often invoke in development, which is capacity, right? And we have a long set of scholarship on Brian Arthur and others who have looked at this sort of question of learning by doing, right? And this is a very ancient idea, actually, that most of the skills that you acquire, like riding bicycles quintessentially, right? You didn't learn by reading about it in a book. You learned by falling off, right? You learned it by doing it. And eventually your brain figured out how to ride a bicycle. Okay, we understand all that. All the new stuff in the B school literature over the last 20 years or so has been about looking at how we can aggregate this, not this learning by doing thing, not just as something that individuals do, how can organizations themselves learn, right? So Peter Senge has made a fortune as a management consultant at MIT with his otherwise very interesting stuff on learning organizations, right? How organizations themselves learn. A wonderful book that you should all read is The Starfish and the Spider by Ori Braffman and Rod Beckstrom, which looks at how these transformations in organizational design are occurring with instances like Wiki, with instances of other online businesses that are just flourishing by being open source, by constantly innovating and innovating and innovating, and just becoming very, very different over time, right? So we're starting to get a language for making some sense of all of that. And up until this week, I would have used Toyota as an example of a big company that can do the same kind of thing. Nonetheless, I'm pretty sure that in a month this will be a blip, right? Toyota is such an incredibly interesting company to study precisely because even something like this, which would just bring down an orthodox big car company, in the grand scheme of things, I think it'll be a blip. Anyway, that's by the by. Okay, so we kind of have we have a language, we have a theory, sort of tools for making sense of these kind of capacity problems. If I want to talk about sort of the herding cats problem as this problem with coordination, I think this other way in which we learn, which is an extension of this herding cat stuff, is learning by contesting, right? It's not just learning by doing in the sense of acquiring a skill, and it's not just learning by doing things as part of teams. It has to do with how we address particular kinds of problems that don't have solutions ex ante, right? What do I mean by that? It means when you're starting out, it's not at all obvious what the solution will be, right? The famous example that my colleague at the Kennedy School uses, Ron Heifetz, is to do with peace accords, right? When the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland are trying to figure out how to reconcile their differences, right? There isn't an answer to that particular problem, ex ante. You don't know what the answer is, right? Ex post, after the fact, you can look back, all right, and say, yeah, here's how we got to the solution that became the binding solution, the one that we all agreed to. But that solution only emerged in and through that process of dialogue and contestation. It was not at all obvious up front that this was the option. And even if it was, right, even if some bright spark said, you know what, 2 years down the track, I reckon this is what the end result's going to look like, right? You can't fast forward that. You can't jump that chasm in a single bound, right? You have to do all the endless work of all the processing in order to be able to arrive at the answer, all right? And that answer has a content and a legitimacy that's been forged in and through that process of dialogue and contestation. It's a very different kind of problem, right? It's not a problem that if you just throw more smart people at it, it will be resolved. It's not a problem if you just throw billions more dollars at it, it'll be solved, right? When we as the international aid architecture system people, right, we want it to be a smart people problem. We love being invited to the 12 people in the room who get to talk about these things, right? On Thursday, I've been invited to be part of a big discussion group on Pakistan. Just like here, I know nothing about climate change. I know nothing about Pakistan, right? But I love being invited to talk about Pakistan because it makes me feel good. It makes me justify all my years of education worrying about this kind of stuff, right? But that's how the system fundamentally works, right? The notion that there actually isn't an answer to a lot of these key problems, they all have to be painstakingly negotiated, that completely freezes up the system, right? The system can't function with those kinds of problems because you can't throw an expert at it and you can't throw lots of money at it, right? Nonetheless, these are very real problems. They are 21st century problems on the table for us to deal with now. And it's not the problems of the problem, it's the problem of the architecture. right? And what we've got to completely redo is put the architecture behind the problems, not ahead, right? Because what we do too often is just reverse engineer things. We do stuff we can solve. We do well what the existing systems happen to be able to do, rather than actually solve the problems that we encounter. Right? And so if you are familiar with some of the recent work over the last decade or so in deliberative democracy, I think this is one particular realm of political science where some really interesting stuff is going on. Jim Fishkin and Bruce Ackerman have a wonderful little book called Deliberation Day, which I strongly encourage you to read, which is the basic argument that, well, all this shouting and yelling by Glenn Beck and everybody else about healthcare this and Bolshevik that and all the rest of it that's going on, right? You cannot get a sensible answer out of that kind if that's the tone and terms of debate, right? It's just nuts, right? What we need is a completely different architecture. It's not like if we had a better organization out there or a smarter people, we'd solve this problem, or a louder person that we'd get a better answer, or a more convincing person, better evidence, more reason, right? These are not those kinds of problems. They are deliberative problems. We have to talk about them, argue about them, disagree over them enough times that eventually, over the time, we eventually reach something like a workable solution to these things. Right? Now that's taken hundreds of years to do that in Western countries, right? Hundreds of years to get rid of slavery, to give women the vote, right? To give African Americans the vote, or minorities the vote more generally, right? Those were not great policy solutions that were concocted overnight by bright people. They were things that were painstakingly lobbied for. People committed their lives, their generations, in order to be able to turn those kinds of things around, right? So I would suggest the lesson from history for a lot of this stuff, for a lot of these very contested types of solutional issues, is that we need to be engaged in and see ourselves as being engaged in for very much the long haul, right? But if you're going to go for work for an organization in Washington, if you're going to go work for an organization in Burlington, all right, the imperatives of the organization you'll work for is, what have you achieved in the last 2 years? What's your 5-year plan look like, right? Have you achieved anything? And if you really want to torture yourself, you'll subject yourself to a randomized control design to be able to try and prove what really works, right? And you won't be able to achieve any of those kind of things, right? What you have to be able to do is be able to recognize that you are in this for a long, deliberative process that may well outlive your lifetime. The challenge, of course, with the climate change is maybe we haven't got a couple of lifetimes, right? So that just ups the ante even more, right? But the challenge for these kinds of problems is that we just don't have an architecture for addressing them, and we need to think about it in different ways. So again, to come back to my friend Ron Heifetz, the single most common source of leadership failure in all sorts of life, in politics, community life, business, non-profit sector, is that people, especially those in position of authority, treat adaptive challenges like technical problems, right? If only we got more evidence, if only we got smarter people, if only someone gave us a big grant, we'd be able to solve it, all right? They're not those kinds of problems. Those things certainly may help. Sure, having nicer buildings and better evidence and all the rest is very necessary, but very, very insufficient for addressing these kind of things. Let's just have as I conclude here, I want to sort of look at some of the data, what we know already about this variation, because I think one of the best ways that we can start to put a deliberative frame around a lot of these issues is to recognize that even at a national level, as we'll see at a subnational level, there is incredible variation with how all of these things have happened, right? And so rather than searching for the solution, a mentality, a sensibility around trying to look for interesting local variations and then reproducing not so much the innovations themselves, though that may be important, right? If someone comes up with, if there is actually a silver bullet solution, great. I strongly suspect, at least institutionally, that there just won't be a silver bullet. There'll be lots of little ones, and we've got to try and replicate the system that produces those systems, reproduce the system that produces those local innovations, not necessarily the innovations themselves. Okay. The good news, or the bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that you've still got plenty of work to do here in your own backyard, right? This is from the WDR, looking at rich countries versus the percentage of respondents who consider climate change a serious problem. And the paradox for this, it seems to be that the poorer countries have kind of already got this, right? So the rich countries down here, which you would think otherwise have lots more to, have kind of already won a lot of these big battles, actually haven't. So at a big international sweep kind of level, there's still plenty of work to be done, even here. One of the lowest scoring countries in the whole world on people who consider climate change a serious problem, as per this particular source that's cited in the WDR. We'll just go quickly through a couple of these. All right? Here's an interesting sort of graph that I put together a while ago, looking at just energy use and GNI per capita. And again, you see wild variations, right? How did this actually come about? I don't know. All right? But I think one of your tasks, if you're really committed to a lot of this stuff, is not just helping understand what this actual graph, the shape looks like, but to say, how did these guys figure this out? How did they get to be so rich and so low use in their energy? Now, maybe they're Iceland. Maybe they just got lucky that God produced a whole bunch of thermal energy underneath all their rocks, and they can, and so that's an exogenous, quintessential exogenous solution. But try and find useful comparisons. Right? Why is it that other countries that are similar, otherwise pretty similar, manage to be able to do things differently? Right? And one of the general principles here is that someone, somewhere, somehow has found a better way to do it. Right? And rather than trying to reinvent that local wheel, learn about how that difference has occurred. All right, here's another different one from the recently released EPI index. The Environmental Performance Index just came out last week, so I very quickly sort of put it into one of these things as well. All right? Why is it, for example, that Luxembourg has a lower score with a GNI of over $65,000 per year, and humble little Costa Rica down here at about 6,000 or 7,000 gets a higher score, right? Now, I don't know. You guys know probably more about each of those countries, but as an array for looking about these kind of things, I would be really interested to know how it is that Colombia and Costa Rica and other countries clustered up here managed to do this. Now, again, maybe there's some accident of history, maybe it's just the geography of where they are, but the Central American countries, I think, are really, really interesting, precisely because you've got Costa Rica on one side and Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador all around them, who are kind of not exactly poster children for good governance. All right? So somewhere, somehow, these countries have figured out a better way to do it. Right? And so we need to do that. All right. So the general principle for a lot of this is that there are these are international variations. The last one here is on carbon emissions. Right? You can see, again, the Luxembourgians sort of way out here. Don't know what poor old Trinidad and Tobago is doing to burn up huge amounts of carbon, given how poor and small they are. But nonetheless, the array itself is interesting, right? And understanding where those sources of variation come from, I think, is a really a fruitful thing to do. Let's push the unit of analysis down a little bit, though. This last one on just looking at governance and environmental performance. More or less, countries that are well governed tend to have better performance. But interestingly, this next one also looks at the differences between what democracies do by way of outputs in terms of the laws they pass and the agreements that they sign up to versus the actual outcomes, what they actually accomplish. Right? So democracies do better on saying things, but not so well on doing things. If you want to make that simple distinction, there's kind of a wildly different sort of scatter plot there for how these different kind of numbers play out. Right? But the point is, there is so much variation. Right? So there isn't, at least at a global level, a solution to all of this, even if it's around governance questions. There are just huge variations. Let's push it down. Let's look at within the United States. Right? There's another one from the WDR, and in terms of the point of this one is to show that if we could just get the SUVs off the road down to and get everyone driving normal cars, that would free up energy requirements for 1.6 billion people in the rest of the world. Right? So that's the shift. Right? So given that the US is already still got a lot to learn, as we saw from that opening slide with respect to climate change, I think that one of the very powerful cases from a development point of view is that to the extent there is fungibility across these kind of things, that's the kind of order of magnitude that we're talking about for these across these differences. Here within the United States, you have incredible variation again across the different states about who's doing what. Right? Understanding all of that is really important too. I sat next to Michael Dworkin, fortuitously, on the plane on the way up here, the director of the Institute for Environment and Development, Vermont Law School, and there's a great New Yorker cartoon where there's a guy saying, everything I learnt in life was stealing other people's PowerPoints on planes. I wish I could have stolen some of his stuff. It's great graphs looking at California relative to the US average and Vermont relative to the US average, way down. Right? So what was it about the failed state of California with the conservative governments in power that nonetheless produced pretty unbelievably progressive carbon use restrictions? Right? What was it about Vermont that enabled those things to happen? How can we look at that and replicate that, right? Rather than just searching for the solution, right? So, how can the arc of these different things be bent? How can we understand the variation around all of these things? Well, the conclusion out of all of this is there just isn't an answer. It's not that we have to teach other people how to do all of this stuff. The way in which we get to these things won't be led by some big charismatic figure who's going to find out, or some big scientist at least, who is going to find out the answer to these things. I think there are 4 general principles that we can look at, and I'll conclude on this note. The first is this, understand variation, both across countries and within countries, but also across time. Right? If there's one thing I would leave you with to do, at least in your scholarship space, read lots of history. Right? Read how women got the vote. Read how slavery was ended. Right? Look at what the serious resistance and struggle people encountered over 70 years or more in order to be able to change these kinds of things. Right? Relentless devotion to politics, to engaging in questions, and to keep committing, to keep coming back in spite of failure. Right? And that this Adam Hochschild's Bury These Chains, Lynn Hunt's Inventing Human Rights, a wonderful, wonderful book. And if I had to recommend one book that you read that you probably won't read, Inventing Human Rights by Lynn Hunt. Fabulous, fabulous book about how we went from a world where judicial torture and slavery was normal in 1750 to a world of Thomas Paine and the rights of man and citizen, to the French Revolution, liberty, fraternity, equality. Mary Wollstonecraft writing about the equality of sexes. How did we go that? How did that happen? It was inconceivable in 1750 that slavery was wrong. It was inconceivable that women were equal as men in 1750. Right? It was inconceivable that torturing people was a wrong way to extract the truth. Right? And yet, a couple of years in the scheme of human history, 40 years later, boom, gone, as an idea, right? As an idea. As policy and practice, it actually took a way longer for that actually to change. Lynn Hunt's book does a marvelous job of being able to explain all of that, right? How did that come about? By relentless devotion to trying to change things both at the macro system, changing the law, all right, but also changing how people thought about these particular things. Okay. We need to disseminate, aggregate, and adapt. Right? Relentlessly share, contextualize, and improve. Right? There isn't an answer. There are answers, plural. And what we need is new systems that will share all of that stuff. It may be that things work across different cultural and environmental spaces. Great if they do. But it's the idea of learning from other people. Right? That's the systematization of learning about innovation, about new and better ways of doing things. That's what we haven't yet got, right? And that's a whole different architecture we need for doing that, to do that seriously, right? We've got individual instances of that, but we haven't got system-wide levels of that. And that's what I think we really need to do. And that's why these books by Peter Senge and Brafman and Beckstrom, these other books, which are otherwise sort of more in the B-school kind of literature, I think are really relevant to the kinds of ways in which we're thinking about these issues here. I think we need to, thirdly, and then these last two, is craft a much better evidence policy practice coherence. Right? It really bugs me that at least in the research world, and I'm a researcher, that's what I do for a living, it's what I care about, it's what I know, but people sort of think, well, if only we got the evidence right, if only people listened to my evidence, then they would change and they would believe. Right? You cannot have any semblance of a historical understanding of how the world works if you think that evidence itself produces these epiphanies in people's minds and they suddenly change what they're going to do. Right? The wonderful book that Jonah Lehrer wrote that just came out a year or so ago called How We Decide. I really strongly encourage you to read that book as well. Right? These are all the non-environmental books that I'm suggesting to you that I think are really relevant to environment, but that you are in a better position than I am to try and figure out how those all go together. Right? Those are all those sort of things are really crucial for making sure that our heads and our hearts and our hands, or engines, wheels, and axles, choose your favorite metaphor, how all those different things come together. Right? Research is really necessary, right? And of course, that's really, really necessary, but very, very insufficient for how we ultimately change things. Changing things is about the hard work of trying to change people's minds and their attitudes and their beliefs, and that happens largely through emotional and door-to-door negotiated resolutions, not because people have epiphanies that suddenly you've produced a nice regression model that says, see, my evidence points to the fact that this is right. Right? That's a part of it, because you don't want to be standing on a flimsy evidence base. Your evidence base has to be good, but it's ultimately very insufficient for all that. The last thing is this sort of notion of contestation and facilitating fair fights. Right? I think that I literally got a tear in my eye last week when I was watching Obama at the Republican caucus meetings. Right? His Q&A was genius. If you haven't seen that, and you're a young person, you've never been trashed in your life, you've never been publicly assaulted in your life, you have no idea how difficult it is to compose to remain composed under that kind of pressure and to be able to weave together different answers in a way that not just disarms but informs and deliberates on a particular issue. Maureen Dowd called it a master civics class in her op-ed piece in The Weekend. It really, really was. Right? So irrespective of your political affiliations or your ideological predilections, right, as a master class in how deliberative democracy can occur, that was moving precisely because it's so rare. Right? But it shouldn't be rare. It doesn't need to be rare. It can be how we resolve a lot of these kind of decisions, because because there aren't answers to a lot of these kind of questions. Right? How you solve a deficit problem, how you enact climate change, and how you deal with the healthcare debates. Right? There needs to be evidence, but ultimately resolutions need to be crafted through a deliberative process, and we haven't not got anything like an effective deliberative process for addressing those kinds of problems. All right? Key aspects of all these things are going to be ugly. They're going to be unknown and unknowable. Right? And we've got to be okay with that. We as researchers at least are so complicit in trying to provide the answer. We want there to be an answer. Right? And a lot of times there just isn't ex ante. There becomes an answer by negotiation. And I think that's the really crucial part that we need to do that. So you as an individual are an agent, and you should be getting the best education you can. You should be getting yourself as knowledgeable as you can be about these issues. You should be getting as knowledgeable as you can about how other people think about these as well. You should be as knowledgeable as you can about how similar kinds of struggles and contests have been waged historically, because they'll be both sobering and inspiring at the same time. You will do that as part of an organization. Once you graduate from here, you'll hopefully be employed by a group that you like and by an organization whose goals you believe in, and that you want to try and change things. But that's going to be largely then about trying to do the hard work of negotiating with lots of people who are often very different from you, as much as it is about trying to get the best evidence you can. Right? Trying to change people's behavior is only partially going to be dependent on how well you collect the evidence. But finally, you'll just not only be an agent working for a particular organization, you'll be an organization working as part of a broader system. And it's that broader system that is the big picture challenge that we all confront. We don't have an answer. That system, as it's currently structured, is too wed to being able to reward big solutions to problems, to wanting smart people with lots of resources to be able to find them very quickly, and to find them on the basis of some technical analysis. Right? A key part of the missing ingredient, the salt in the stew, if you will, the small part that actually around which a lot of these other things turn, is how we engage with these questions of deliberation. And learning how other good deliberators function is part of how you learn to do it. But back to the learning by doing kind of idea, you've got to do it yourself in order to be able to function in that space in an effective way. It's a skill, like any other skill, that you learn by doing. And I think the more we can have our systems and our organizations and our agents producing the kinds of answers that are legitimate, that are open, that are innovative, that are open source, that keep aggregating and learning and being adapted by each individual group around the world, we will have not only a better architecture for thinking about our problems in general, but our problems that manifest themselves most graphically in the Getting to 350 issues. Thanks very much. Okay.
A few minutes for questions and discussion. I should point out that in the Solutions Journal, if you take a look at the opening editorial, we very explicitly are trying to make this journal a venue for dialogue and discussion and deliberation and not debate in the conventional way. So I think it very much is in the spirit of what you're talking about. Let's pass around the microphone because for the webinar, for the people on the other side to hear us, and we have quite a few people listening live to your webinar, we need to talk into the microphone. So let's go first. Whoa.
I'll do it.
Two quick questions. First, is there anything that we should be doing differently because we're in a hurry? And second, about your first point, maybe we should just look at China because something is happening there apparently.
The question was, are there things we can do now that in a shorter time frame, just because the the issues are so urgent, and are there lessons from China? For you? Let me try and deal with the second part first. China is interesting in a number of different ways, both because of the incredible rate of change that it's been able to bring about, but also because a lot of the great damage that's been wrought on the environment and elsewhere along the way. China's also been at the forefront, as was declared in the New York Times last week, at being at the forefront of new energy technologies and wind power and solar power and all that sort of thing. The challenge always of learning from China is that its bureaucratic, its system, right, its organizational operating system, is not reproducible. We don't want the Chinese operating system functioning in a Western democracy or any democracy for that matter, right? So it's hard in that sense to at an operating system level to do that. But I think there are, to the extent that there are technical innovations that the Chinese organizations have come up, or the products they've invented, or ways that they've gone about pricing their resources and all that sort of stuff, if there are technical lessons that are indeed transferable across political and cultural boundaries, absolutely. Then there's heaps to be learned from all of that. All I know about rapid change, in terms of doing things faster, is that it's even more contentious than doing things in the slower run. Right? Most of the big revolutions of history that we know happened when rapid change was occurring. Usually rapid change for the better, I should add, not just rapid change because things were jumping off a cliff. Right? If you look at the British civil wars, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, all the revolutions that historians have studied, most of these happened on the cusp of very big rapid change occurring. So my point with respect to trying to do things fast is, if the imperatives of the moment are such that we actually do need to do things fast, or it's going to be too late, I would just suggest there needs to be a countervailing set of mechanisms in place for diffusing, shall we say, a lot of the change a lot of the heat that rapid change is going to occur, that's going to give off. I think part of part of Obama's problem is that there has been this sort of perception of rapid change, even though there hasn't actually much been accomplished, but the perception that things are changing, and that gets people nervous. Even rich people, especially rich people, get upset when they think that things are changing. So they vote on the one hand for change, but they're actually very scared about change. We're all very nervous about change. Change is hard. Change is disrupting. Whether it be graduating from college is hard, or getting married is hard, and those are all changes that are stressful. And you try and do that across a system, there's going to be smoke and fury going everywhere. All right. So I think as much as we need to worry about the technology and the organizing of compressing timeframes that perhaps are unprecedented almost with respect to these things, the countervailing side of that to me has to be that we have to have mechanisms for legitimately and effectively dealing with the heat that change is going to give off, because there's going to be a lot of it.
I have a question about the big stack. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So about the big stack. So you mentioned that the big stack is basically the encounter between the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And you put it as an example that microcredit has not really made a system change, and yet has helped improve the conditions of millions of people. So I think maybe I know what you mean, but I'm not sure. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what is the system change that you think projects like microcredit are not doing. And also my question is, after what you just said, is should we give microcredit a little more time? I mean, it has only been around for a couple of decades, after all.
Right. Yeah, that's an absolutely fair question. I guess what I was trying to, the kinds of projects that I'm most interested in studying now are ones that get the best of this top-down and bottom-up at the same time, which is to say they're big enough to actually change the systems within which they work, but they're also flexible enough to be able to encourage context-specific, idiosyncratic innovation and variation as and when they occur. Now, it may well be the case that existing microcredit systems, if we just hung around long enough, that actually is the way in which change occurs. This happens to be what I did my PhD on, so I looked at 19th century credit cooperatives and different modalities of doing microcredit over a 50-year period, from the 1850s through to 1900, and which kind of systems were actually changing fundamentally the banking systems within which they were operating, as opposed to just providing more services to poor people, as laudable and as important as that, and that is. And the point here would be to say there isn't just a single solution called microfinance. Part of what I was then looking at in late 20th century things was variations on the way in which microfinance is done. Right? And the problem with believing that the Grameen Bank is the solution for microfinance is that it becomes a monopoly. It becomes hegemonic in the way in which we think about these things, and it closes off, to use that other ways of doing things. There are other Indian NGOs that are doing microfinance, for example, that are much smaller and much humbler, but I would argue have been much more effective actually in changing the policies of the Indonesian banking system, of the Indian banking system, for the other 85% of Indians who actually do their banking through a regular system that just doesn't happen to reach yet to the poor. The point is to encourage innovation that's going to change a system, and different modalities of doing microcredit are more or less successful at doing that. But how long it actually takes, we'll only know that looking back rather than going forward.
Okay, we're almost at the end of our time, and we have one more quick question and quick answer.
Thanks. I'd just like to get your thinking and some thoughts about how extreme events affect the flow of information top down and bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know from climate change, or what the prediction shows, is that there's not only great uncertainty, but there will be moments of great extreme consequence. Naomi Klein's thinking in shock doctrine is that that's a point of strategy, and that we should actually prepare for those moments.
Huh.
So, one, could you comment on that? And two, is it an occasion for the kind of bottom-up work to actually see some more immediacy at top-down frameworking?
I'm going to stray outside my comfort zone and try to provide an answer. But my experiences with sort of natural phenomena, rapid change phenomena that had very different kinds of outcomes was with the tsunami a couple of years ago. The team that I was working with in Indonesia was able to be very much part of the solution in Aceh when 180,000 people died in that part of the world. And so a truly exogenous event happens that was actually able to so fundamentally alter the system, right? The dynamics between which all these different governments and rebel groups and NGOs were all operating, that it just completely, the system had to be reinvented from scratch. And because of good luck and good management, there was actually a new system put in place, and fingers crossed, the peace agreement that was signed after 30 years of bloodshed is still holding, right? Happy, good story, right? Go a couple of thousand miles to the west, you go to Sri Lanka, where that event wasn't so, it was still horrific. It wasn't as horrific as it was in Aceh, but it made things worse. Right? Now, I think there is a key role in big seismic events like that in the agency sort of question. How we deal with Haiti in the first month has major bearings, I think, for what happens afterwards. I think that's sort of the essence of why there's so much initial an imperative to respond really quickly to all of that. But unless the change is such that it alters the broader systems within which the responses are ultimately conducted, what's going to ultimately determine what happens in Haiti is going to be what happens in 6 weeks' time, when all the cameras have gone and Cooper Anderson, whatever his name is not running around saving babies, and once all of the media circus is left and development normal, so to speak, has to go back to doing what it does. And to me, certainly these big seismic events can be great moments of opportunity. They can also just ruin whatever was actually accomplished, usually in very painstaking and fragile sort of ways. I don't think it's automatic that good things do happen. I think good things can happen, but the agency question becomes even more crucial in those immediate weeks after a disaster happens. But I think for most of us who are into the development, and as opposed to just sort of relief work, the more vexing question is what sort of equilibrium is left to go from 6 weeks to 6 years after those kinds of events have happened. And that's much more painstaking, boring, negotiated kind of work. And the virtue and the vice of those first 6 weeks is that there's billions of dollars to play with. There's a lot of moral energy and commitment to doing things. Whereas, you know, the real task of rebuilding the political system, rebuilding the legal infrastructure of a country like that, there isn't an answer to that. There's only one that's negotiated and put together. And if you've completely undermined the credibility of that system by what's happened in those first 6 weeks, then you're always playing catch up thereafter.
Okay, thanks. I think that's